For as long as many of us can remember, the topic of abortions has been front and center in our political landscape. And now Pennsylvania is in the national conversation after the State House recently passed a bill which would ban abortions of fetuses diagnosed with Down syndrome. One of the co-authors of that bill, York County State Representative Klunk, is our guest this morning on the Fox 43 Capitol Beat. Thank you. Finally got you in studio. First time on the show. Really do appreciate it. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But first, this week, you had a bill which unanimously passed out of the Labor Committee, which would essentially make it tougher for employers and workplaces to stifle a sexual harassment investigation. How does that work?
Yes, thanks, Matt, for having me on this morning. This week was a big week for workers here in Pennsylvania out of the Labor Committee. So we, over the past 2 sessions, have held a number of hearings on sexual harassment in the workplace. And out of those hearings, we sat down with stakeholders across the state to really take a look at what we can do in the workplace regarding sexual harassment. So in Pennsylvania right now, employers can require a non-disclosure agreement related to sexual harassment of an employee as a condition of employment. And what that means is that that employee would be required to not say a word about that sexual harassment that is going on in the workplace. So what my bill does, along with Representative Morgan Cephas, teamed up with a Democrat on this. It's a bipartisan bill because it's a bipartisan issue. It's not a Republican or Democrat issue. It's about the employees of Pennsylvania. So what the bill does, it would ban those non-disclosure agreements as a condition of employment here in Pennsylvania. Now, we still allow for voluntary agreements in those situations where maybe a victim of sexual harassment would want to sign a non-disclosure agreement. We found through stakeholders and some of those advocates that sometimes that's the case and they want that. So we still do allow for that.
Your other bill, which just passed the House, which would ban abortions in a Down syndrome diagnosis. Why did you propose this? How much of an issue is this in Pennsylvania? So
this is, this is certainly an issue. We have a number of babies that are aborted across the state every single year because of a Down syndrome diagnosis. And here in Pennsylvania, we only limit abortions up to 24 weeks. And the only limitation in those 24 weeks when you cannot have an abortion right now is because of a gender selection of a child. So in Pennsylvania, we do not allow you to have abortion based on a boy or a girl sex selection.
With Down syndrome, though, how much of it? I mean, you said there's a number, but what is the number?
A couple hundred. It just again depends on the year, depends on the diagnosis. It's not an exact number every year, but again, a couple hundred here in Pennsylvania. And the thing is, at the end of the day, we need to be protecting those children in the womb. They're discriminated against before they're even born. And in the same vein as we don't discriminate against a boy or girl in the womb, Down syndrome would be the same based on that diagnosis.
I'm wondering, just kind of to push you on that a little bit, because in Pennsylvania, I'm pretty sure you don't have to necessarily disclose why you're having an abortion. So where does the couple hundred come from? How is that figured out?
So that's based on national statistics of how many births there are and what is the prevalence of Down syndrome based on the number of births every year, based on Down syndrome, how many diagnoses.
So not necessarily Pennsylvania, but this is a national thing.
Right. So nationally, you take the numbers and then you break them down based on the number of births, and that's how you would get to the number.
I know the U.S. Supreme Court last week in Indiana said they're not going to get involved, and they're going to remain, that bill is going to remain blocked, which would basically is your same bill. And then Governor Wolf has said he would veto this bill essentially anyway. So where does this leave you and some of your advocates as it goes into the Senate?
So we don't stop because this issue is still a very important issue, especially to those families who advocate for this issue. I've talked with a number of them. And on this issue, our governor has said that he's going to veto it. Doesn't mean that we don't. I'm a duly elected member of the State House.
Sure.
The State Senate is considering taking this up. And we need to be pushing this issue. Our own governor, back in March, he named March. Every year he names it as Intellectual Disabilities Awareness Month. So he clearly has a heart for these individuals when they're born. I'm just hoping he has a heart for them in the womb.
How do you enforce this bill?
So this bill would go back, again, this is an Abortion Control Act, it's nothing new. We don't change anything in the enforcement mechanism because it's already there. So that goes back to the individual performing the abortion. So it would come back to the doctor who would know or have reason to know that the individual would be receiving the abortion based on that Down syndrome diagnosis.
Theoretically, though, because you don't necessarily have to disclose why you're having an abortion, couldn't someone, say they're 16 years old, God forbid, pregnant that young, say, I can't support this child, I need to have an abortion? That fetus happens to have a Down syndrome diagnosis. So how do you, again, enforce that this is because of a Down syndrome diagnosis?
Again, that would come back to, again, it would be very case specific. It would be depending upon the case facts. Here in Pennsylvania, you can get an abortion, up until 24 weeks. The only limitation right now is for gender selection. We're adding the diagnosis of Down syndrome. And one thing that I do want your viewers to understand is that we're changing nothing when it comes to those exceptions. I want to contrast that with what's going on in Alabama. In Alabama, their bill did not include some of the exceptions that we have here in Pennsylvania, especially the rape incest provision. So in this bill, it specifically states that we still keep those exceptions in rape, incest, health of the mother that's already included in the Abortion Control Act, just making sure it remains there.
Absolutely. The big picture in all of this, which is something that so many people have this is their main case. Why do politicians have a greater say over what a woman does with their body than a doctor?
Well, so I'm a mother. I just had my daughter. It'll be 18 months here this next week. And I look at it this way, and again, the Supreme Court has said this too, the state has a vested interest in protecting life. And when that life kind of takes hold, that's kind of been this the standard of viability. And here in Pennsylvania, we've pushed some other bills looking at viability issues. Right now it's 24 weeks. We've had some other bills that roll it back to 20 weeks because the science is there, where babies can live outside of the womb at 20 weeks and even a little bit before that. So we do have a vested interest because we want to make sure that life, if that life is living and that life can sustain itself outside of the womb, that we are making sure that we're protecting that life and balancing that with those exceptions that I mentioned before.
Did you or Speaker Terzai consult with any doctors in writing this bill?
Yes, I've actually talked with some doctors and healthcare practitioners on this issue, and also some patients, and again, just women in my own friend circle and friend group too.
Say Representative Kate Klunk of York County, thank you so much for joining us, especially on the heels of a very busy month, June budget month up in Harrisburg, so a lot going on. Fox 43 Morning News, we'll be right back.
Thank you.